I see a lot of relationships where both partners are just surviving. The negative cycle has come to dominate their interactions to the point where it feels like both partners are against each other rather than for each other. Communication is broken down, and both partners are on the defense. Now, in the world of trauma, this takes a tremendous toll on the central nervous system, as both partners are likely in a constant mode of fight or flight, or maybe even freeze and frozen in a state of disassociation. So over time, the stress of just surviving that puts on their bodies breaks down their immune system, contributes towards anxiety and depression and loneliness, and ultimately shortens their lifespan. I'd say that's some pretty drastic consequences of trying to survive in a relationship. In this episode, I want to paint a picture of a couple who is surviving versus a couple that is thriving in their relationship, and what I feel are the essential elements of both. This way you can know where to focus your efforts in your own relationship and how to move from surviving to thriving. Welcome to Trauma-Free Relationship. I'm Tom Philp, your host, and as a therapist, I've spent over 10,000 hours helping couples work through their trauma so they can repair ruptures, heal their wounds, and communicate from a place of wholeness and connection. Let's get started. Okay, as I mentioned in the opening, I'm going to paint a picture here of a couple that is surviving versus a couple that is thriving. And we're going to talk about it through what I consider to be those essential elements that make for survival versus surviving versus thriving. So imagine that you're sitting in my chair for a moment and you're looking at a couple sitting on the couch across from you. Now, that couple may have come to you for a little tune-up, or they may be in great distress, because I can see couples from across the spectrum. But your job is to help them. But to do that, you have to understand where they are in order to know where to point your interventions. So with that said, here's what I want to focus on to determine whether a couple is thriving versus surviving, or somewhere in between in their relationship. So the first thing I focus on is what happens when they disconnect. I'll often ask a couple, what does disconnection look like in your relationship? If I'm a fly on the wall and you guys are disconnecting, whether you want to call it an argument, a rupture, whatever it may be, what does that look like? Paint me a picture. What would I see? What would I hear? So that I understand that when there's a rupture in the relationship, how do they handle that disconnection and that stress? Because the reality is that in most couples, there is usually a stress response of some kind to their central nervous system that kicks in to protect them during disconnection. When we disconnect from people that we are attached to, whether it's our parents or whether it's our partner as adults, our body has learned how to protect itself. And so it automatically kicks in those protective devices. This is not a conscious thought, but rather a learned response from how we have learned to protect ourselves and our wounds, certainly past wounds, and traumas from either when we were growing up or first marriages or whatever might have created that. So I want to understand, what does that look like when a couple is disconnecting? One partner might shut down, they might get quiet, or they might remove themselves from the conversation. The other partner might push for interaction. They might turn up the heat. They might get more aggressive or put more pressure on their partner to respond and be more emotionally available. And this response from both partners usually creates what I call a defensive cycle, or for short, a cycle, which if left unchecked can have a life of its own in the relationship, and that pattern can come to actually dominate the interactions of the couples. So when I see a couple that is on the extreme of that spectrum and they're in severe distress, meaning that they can't hardly say two words to each other. They feel like they're walking on eggshells. They're constantly in defense mode, in protection. That is because the cycle has come to dominate almost every interaction. And they are not only having difficulty interacting with each other, but they are even going into those interactions anticipating the breakdown in connection, the breakdown in communication, the defensiveness of each other. So one of the first things I learn is, what is the level of the cycle? Is it something that's relatively under control, or is it something that has come to dominate the relationship? And so that pattern is what I'm really looking for. Obviously, there can be variations in that pattern, but I'm really looking for the defensiveness versus vulnerability continuum, because vulnerability is the royal road to connection. All right, we can't connect through our defensiveness, through our protection. We can only connect through our vulnerability. So that tells me a lot about the couple right up front, is what does that cycle look like and where are they on that cycle? The second thing I might look for is how emotionally dysregulated is one or both partners during times of disconnection. When they're connecting, if they're connecting at all, then those emotion dysregulations don't show up. It's when they're disconnecting that emotion dysregulation shows up. So does one partner completely shut down and disassociate? Does one partner get so aggressive that they criticize, complain, and attack the character of the other? Do they cuss and throw things? Or more specifically, what triggered them to get them so dysregulated in the first place? So I want to know, how does each partner manage the emotions within themselves? Do they understand their triggers? Do they understand their sensitivities? Do they understand the moments at which they become dysregulated? And if so, how do they get themselves re-regulated? These are all really important factors for me to know, because it helps me understand, how does this couple manage the emotional landscape between them? When one partner gets dysregulated, is the other partner able to reach that person, to soothe that person, to re-regulate that person, to offer a sense of empathy, comfort, caring? Or do they get dysregulated themselves where the cycle kicks in? Does the partner that gets dysregulated able to re-regulate themselves, self-soothing? Are they able to manage that themselves so that they can come and bring whatever was triggered to their partner in a softer, more gentle way so they can get the comfort that they're desiring? So I'm really looking for, how do they manage the emotional landscape, not only within themselves, but between themselves as well. The third thing I look for is whether the couple is able to come back and repair their ruptures. So if they have a rupture, if they do disconnect, even if they get dysregulated, are they able to come back and talk through things? Can they apologize? Can they take responsibility for their role in the cycle? Can they soften? How long does it take for them to make those repairs? 1 hour? 3 days? How long do they stay dysregulated? And what do they learn and take away from their repairs so that they don't repeat them again? So can they come back, make those repairs, talk things through so that they feel like they're able to learn more about each other and they are able to grow together? And they do that by being able to make those repairs. Some couples can make repairs within a few hours. Some couples, it might take several days, even weeks sometimes. Some couples never have repairs. I've sat with many, many couples, especially on that extreme end of the continuum where they're in severe distress, and most likely those negative cycles and traumas constantly get triggered and so on and so forth. And so with those couples, they oftentimes tell me they rarely ever come back and make repairs. They're rarely ever able to sit down and talk through what happened, why it happened, what each person was feeling, and then be able to move into a place with more empathy, more validation for each partner. So I really want to understand what that repair process looks like, and if it even happens at all. And finally, I want to look at how they view themselves during times of disconnection and ruptures in the relationship. And this is really important because it tells me about the darker places that those cycles take each partner to. It tells me about the traumas that stay hidden, that often do not come to the surface, but that are often the one or the main motivators that are driving the relational behavior. So our traumas, when they're unhealed, don't just go away. They often are constantly driving our behavior and our motivations to get what they never got in the first place. So the fear of abandonment and rejection, the feelings of not good enough, unlovable, unworthy, not valued, these darker places where we hold our trauma and the way we view ourselves and our partner that aren't just about the current context or the current fight that the couple's having. Those are the places that I really want to get to as well, because I want to understand how I can reach into those darker places and help heal some of that so that it lifts the person onto higher ground so that they are then able to revise and update their view of themselves and their partner, and ultimately what's happening in the relationship as well. So those are some of the things that I look for when I assess a couple in the first 2 or 3 meetings. And this, I'm not always writing things down, but I'm constantly asking myself, what's happening here? What's going on? What does this look like? As the couple's telling me their story, as their life is unfolding in my office, and they're describing how they got together, the ups, the downs, the difficult times, the ruptures, so on and so forth. I'm kind of trying to piece together a little bit of this puzzle of what's happening with this couple to figure out sort of where they are on the continuum and where I need to jump in and try to make an immediate impact to give them some quick wins. So I want to recap here, as hopefully you've sort of been envisioning yourself sitting in my chair and looking at a couple and being in my shoes of what I would be looking at and what that would be like. So let me sort of recap here the difference between surviving versus thriving in a relationship. So a couple that is just surviving might exhibit the following: emotion dysregulation, meaning they can get easily triggered with one another. They might feel like they're walking on eggshells or constantly on the defense. They are dominated by the cycles of protection or cycles of defense. It really overtakes their interactions. They're confused. They don't understand the pattern. They can't see the pattern themselves. They just know they end up walking away frustrated and feeling unheard and uncared for. They have frequent ruptures with very little or no repair, and they likely rarely come back in order to talk things through or to resolve the issues. So again, there's very little repair in their ruptures. They sweep a lot of things under the rug, and then they kind of re-regulate a little bit. They go back to normal day-to-day interactions in life until the next rupture happens, and then they start that process all over. They sweep it under the rug, and so there's this cycle where things blow up, and then we don't ever repair them, and we then pretend like everything's okay, except we keep tripping over this massive lump in the rug. Again, a couple that is surviving is often driven by negative self-concepts. So one or both partners that might be triggered their trauma, where they feel rejected, abandoned, not cared for, unworthy, unlovable, so on and so forth, where lots of those defensive reactions are actually trying to protect those deeper wounds. And then finally, a couple that's just surviving, there's very little sense of safety, security, and very little vulnerability with one another. And as I said before, vulnerability is the royal road to connection. Now, I want to compare that, finally, with a couple that is thriving. So what might that look like? That might look like lots of safety and security. They know and trust their partner will be there for the big things because their partner is there for the little things. They can attune to one another. They provide a sense of safety. They provide a sense of empathy and compassion and validation for one another. They have infrequent cycles. It's not that they don't ever argue. All the research in the world shows that healthy couples argue. But when they do, it's infrequent, and they know how to move through it, and they don't escalate, they de-escalate their arguments. So they don't come to dominate the relationship. So the cycle doesn't take over the relationship. Rather, they know and can see when the cycle happens, and they might need to calm down for a little bit, but they come back together and they talk things through. In a healthy relationship, in a thriving relationship, it's not hard to take a risk and be vulnerable with one another. Again, they know their partner is going to provide them empathy, understanding, and even if in a rough moment where there's some disconnection, they can ask for their needs to be met. Hey, can you not provide me solutions for a moment? Can you just listen? I really just need you to hear this for a second. And they can stop, and they can pause, and they can correct what each other needs in those moments. There's more of a positive self-concept where both partners protect one another's trauma wounds. That's really important because when I've done my job well, I can take a couple from a place where they go triggering one another's traumas and wounds to a place where they move to protecting one another's traumas. And that's really important. They know each other's sensitivities, and they actually seek ways to protect that for each other, not inadvertently triggering that for each other. And then finally, they're emotionally regulated. So they know how to regulate not only their own emotions, they can practice self-soothing if they need to, they can ask for timeouts if they need to, they can understand their own emotional landscape. I'm hurt, I'm upset, I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I'm sad. They can put words to what they're feeling, they communicate those to their partner, and if they do get triggered, they can regulate themselves and not escalate that cycle. And so as a result, they also know how to regulate the emotional landscape between the two of them better. So those are some things I look for, and those are some ways that I sort of assess a couple on a continuum of whether this couple is just barely surviving this relationship or whether they might be thriving in this relationship. And I should add, too, that it's really important to know that all of us fall somewhere on that continuum, but it's not static. It's not written in stone. We ebb and flow. So sometimes relationships have seasons where it feels like things are just a little more rough, a little more difficult. Sometimes relationships have seasons where things feel much better. We're just in a groove. We're clicking. We're getting each other. And those are really great times. And so if you find yourself in a relationship where it feels like sometimes you're in a season where things are more difficult, I would encourage you to reach out to a trained professional that can help. Call us for coaching, or even just have some patience and hang on, because things will get better. So I hope you enjoyed this episode today. I hope this was enlightening for you and sort of gave you a little peek behind the curtain of what happens in a session sometimes, and ways that I look for different aspects of what's happening in relationships that I'm trying to intervene and trying to help, and where they are on that thriving versus surviving continuum. Thank you so much for listening. As always, I really appreciate it. Please keep giving me the great feedback. I love hearing from you guys. And until then, we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to Trauma-Free Relationship, a podcast for the healing of attachment trauma. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, or our website at traumafreerelationship.com. Be sure to look for our next episode on your favorite streaming service.